Today let's talk about world building. What is it and how do you do it? Hi, I'm Hananya Leclerc. I am a multi-genre writer who shares tips and tricks and talks about her life. Now, without further ado, let's get into the video. World building might be one of those topics that I am struggling with the most usually when I am writing my stories. I personally am very much a dialogue-driven writer, so the world building part is usually the thing that I struggle with a little bit. The world building part of the story is essentially creating whatever world your characters are living in, are set in, so whatever the story surrounds is kind of the world around the characters and the world that we are experiencing this story in. So if we're looking at my specific story, this is more or less a contemporary world where we have vampires with the vampire book that I'm writing. If we're looking at, for example, a fantasy book, it might not be a real world setting, so it might not be a contemporary kind of place, but it might be a completely fictionalized place, which is what I usually tend to associate with world building. I tend to think that world building is done mostly by fantasy writers because they create a whole new world that their characters are set in, that their whole story is set in, and I admire that. I envy that, and I am like, teach me how. Although I tend to write more contemporary than fantasy, I do need to find a way to incorporate world building more into my stories, because world building is not only creating a whole complete world from scratch, but it can also be kind of the little things that make up your world. So even if it is cities, kind of the political systems, maybe you have religion in your book, then you want to outline that. There are so many different elements that kind of include world building and that kind of fall under world building that I tend to kind of lose sight of and not really pursue a lot in my stories, but I feel like I need to be better with that. So what does world building actually mean? In a sense, it is, to me, building up the world surrounding your characters, the world that your story is set in. So as I said, this can range from a contemporary world where you introduce fantasy elements like vampires, or it can be completely built from scratch. Whenever you're writing a story that includes multiple different levels of things, and with things I mean people, you have maybe a political system that you want to include some religion. If you have a magic system, you want to definitely outline that. Creatures, if you have specific different creatures in your book. If, for example, we're thinking about The Witcher and you have all these creatures, you want to include that as well into kind of world building because they are all part of your world. So anything that is part of your world is kind of world building. So something that you can also, for example, include is armor, whatever, you know, armor might be there, weapons, if, you know, there are specific ways to travel, if there are teleports, if there are horses, if you use cars, if you use planes, stuff like that is kind of all world building. And if you kind of stay in a contemporary world, a lot of these things are implied because we are experiencing this world as of right now. So it's you know, it's normal for us to think, oh yeah, we're getting around with a car, we're getting around, you know, by bike, or we take the plane if we want to go further. But if you're writing, for example, a fantasy book and you set it in a completely new world and you have something like an aircraft, I don't know, then you might want to explain that your world uses aircrafts to get around. And you don't just want to be like, oh yeah, we took an aircraft, and you're like, wait, what? You don't want to over-explain it. You don't want to say, oh yeah, we have aircrafts because of this and this and this and this reason. But you can say, okay, well, we have aircrafts. Make that clear, or even if it's something that only the rich have and then the poor just have to walk. Stuff like that, you can kind of outline what your world looks like. So you might have the rich and the poor, and then these have luxury ways of getting around. These have just walking. Kind of like that, you kind of show the dynamic between your worlds. You have, you know, kind of different levels to your world, and that can affect your story as a whole because, you know, if you didn't have rich or poor, then everyone would be the same. And there's no conflict between that, so it can form a point of conflict. It can kind of form a goal for your character if they want to, you know, get to that point where they have nice transport and they don't have to walk everywhere. It can also mean that the poor kind of steal stuff from the rich. It can kind of really be implemented in your story. So you want to think about how your world building and your world affects your characters. So if you're living in a contemporary world, you can think about how the world affects you personally because we live it. But if you're thinking about a fantasy world and it's like that, you want to think about how that might affect your main character. If your main character is rich, how would that affect them with, you know, them having all the things versus maybe the poor don't have it. Does he get mobbed? Does his car get stolen or his aircraft or whatever they're getting around on? You kind of want to think about that maybe on how that is perceived through other people in your book, how that can relate to your story. The way that world building can be approached is very different for different writers. Some writers take it very lightly, like me, and I just kind of write down the main things that happen in my story or that might affect my story. So for me, some of the things that might affect my vampire story is that there's actual vampires, that we have different families, and also, you know, families that are good and families that are not so good. And then we have the humans and how that interacts with the vampires and how that might be complicated. Whereas some people might take it way further and they might draw up different maps of their world because they want to kind of find out what the terrain looks like. They want to really go deep into their new world, for example, a fantasy writer. And I know that I keep referencing fantasy writers as if nobody else does world building, but it's just what I think of when I think about world building. Some people might include maps. They might draw kind of heat maps or, you know, all types of maps. Someone that does this on YouTube is Madeleine James. She's fantastic in having so many world building videos out, so I would definitely recommend you check out her videos if you have anything that you want to learn more about world building, because I can only give you the general advice and general things that world building is about because I tend to not really do it. She is awesome at it. She does maps. She really gets deep into the world building part of her book. So if you want to find out more on that, I'll make sure to leave her channel down below. So now that we've kind of covered what you would call world building, how you would approach it is kind of just write down whatever is important to your story. So if you have a royal family, which I have in my more or less historical book, you want to potentially outline, okay, we have a royal family. Do they also govern? Do they have, you know, what does the line of succession look like? How old is their family? What does their paths look like? Kind of have a history to your world. And this can also be kind of described as a backstory, but you kind of want to get them from somewhere, right? They haven't just popped out of nowhere. They came from somewhere. There is a line of succession. This is a royal family. They might have, you know, other royal families or have other kingdoms. Are they in fight with other kingdoms or not? Are they in fight with their own people? There might be rebellion, or there might be, you know, peace, or maybe there was a war previously and they were just recovering from it, and that might affect how your story progresses in the book. So kind of anything that really translates back into the book that you're writing. I do want to make a quick side note to not get too lost in the world building part of your book, because what kind of tends to happen sometimes with writers or newbie writers is they spend all their time world building, all their time figuring out the backstory, the timeline of their story from 500 years before the story actually starts, which in itself is very interesting, and you might, you know, find it useful for your story. You might want to implement it later if you want to write like a backstory, if you want to write a prequel or stuff like that. But you want to at some point start writing your book. You don't want to spend 10 years of your life just world building, creating the world that you love, you know, really deep diving into the backstory and writing all of that without actually writing the book. You want to at some point put it to the side and get to writing the actual book. So that's the only thing that I want to say as a side note. Don't get too lost in the world building part of your book. Yes, you want to make sure you include some stuff in your book that is world building related and that just kind of makes the world feel more real, but at the same time, don't get too lost in trying to write the perfect world for your story. you will sometimes just find out as you go, and you don't want to spend all of your time world building before you write the story. At least in my opinion. I know some people might think of that differently because it might help them to actually see the story come to life and have all the elements that they need to write the story. But for me personally, I am not much of a world builder. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that as a side note. So that's really all I have for you on the world building aspect of your story. If you want to learn more about that, make sure you check out Madeleine James' channel. She's great on world building videos, so make sure you go and give her some love over there, and hopefully that helped you. If this video was more or less helpful to you, please consider leaving a like. If you're enjoying this series, then subscribe down below so you don't miss the next video in the series, which I'm sure will be linked somewhere on screen for you once that is out. And for now, that is all I have for you. So hope to see you in the next video.